Well, I am delighted to be with you here in Port Angeles this morning at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church. It's always a delight to come and be with you. And I bring you greetings from all 87 congregations, all 88 congregations in our Southwestern Washington synod. You are up here at the head of the class. You're at the northernmost end. And the synod goes all the way down to the Columbia River, to Vancouver, Washington, and then out to Stevenson, up the river a little bit, and then back up the I-5 corridor through Tacoma to Federal Way before it scoops around the bottom of the Sound and comes back up your way. So 88 congregations. We have made a pact, a bond with each other to support each other in ministry. And I want to thank you for your ministry. You, from all that I know about you, from other visits, what I see on your website, as I talk to your pastors, as I talk to leaders in your congregation, you are doing a marvelous ministry here in Port Angeles. Both a ministry of gathering God's people together here for worship, for prayer, for song, to be fed at the altar. A wonderful ministry to both seniors and to youth, a wonderful ministry of music here in so many ways. But then you also, as the people of God who've been gathered in to be fed, you also go out back into the community and serve people in a whole variety of ways that are needed in your community. I know that just a week or so ago you had a interfaith vigil with the Jewish community and with all the faith communities to pray together after the killing of the 11 worshipers at Tree of Life. So thank you for the ministry that you do right here. And then thank you also for banding together with all 88 congregations to do ministry that no one congregation could do by itself. You send in a generous portion of your offerings as mission support to the synod. We, in turn, send 40% of that on to Chicago to do ministry throughout the world. But with the 60% that we keep right here, we do lots of good things together as congregations. In the last 8 years, we have founded 8 new congregations in our synod, including 2 Korean congregations, a Chinese congregation, 2 multicultural communities of worship, a Latin American community. So we're actively involved here. You also, through your mission support, are supporting 2 of the newest ministries that we're doing together as a synod, in which you are very involved. The one is called Imagine. You are part of the cohort of congregations that are part of the Imagine program, which is a program for congregations to be revitalized, to think about what are our gifts here and what are the needs out in the community. So you're an active part of the new cohort of Imagine congregations. Also, you're involved in the newest ministry that we put together as a synod. It's called Psalm, program for strengthening active lay ministry. And 2 of your church members are in that. Don and Trudy are both part of the Psalm program, in which we say, as Martin Luther said, the priesthood of all believers. We're all part of God's ministry, and so we need to actively train ourselves, including lay ministries. So that's just a variety of things in which I want to thank you for your ministry with us and in this community as we live as God's people. It's particularly meaningful for me to be here with you today on this Veterans Day weekend, and also as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ending of World War I. It was at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the month in the 11th month of the year that the forces who had been embroiled in World War I signed the armistice. And so we, 100 years later today, we commemorate that. We also, on this Veterans Day, give thanks for the sacrifice and service of all the citizens, but particularly those veterans who have fought in wars, and certainly not just World War I, but the wars have come after. So at the same time that we commemorate and entrust to God's care those who have been affected by war, it's also a good day for us to think about war and peace. Think about war and peace. What part do we play in war, and what part do we play in the making of peace? I remember a book that I read, it's been probably 3 years ago now or so, when I read a book by Melinda Carter. The name of the book is George, Nicholas, and Wilhelm, 3 Royal Cousins and the Road to World War I. And it talks about the fact that King George of England, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany were cousins. Two of them were first cousins, and with a third, they were a third cousin. They were all closely related to each other. And they took that seriously. And in fact, they really tried to use their family tie, their blood family tie, to encourage cooperation amongst these three great powers in Europe. And particularly as things started to get tense, as 1911 was near and there were more pronounced competitions and tensions and minor conflicts brewing, they really hoped that somehow their family tie and the way they could cultivate that could keep the three great nations at peace with each other. But of course, it wasn't just the attraction, it wasn't just the bond of that blood family tie that was at work. There was lots of other forces at work too. There was major economic competition between the nations. There was the historic position of competitor and of wary neighbor that was at work. There was the very entrenched landed aristocracy in the nations, but also the economic pacts that had surrounded them. And so for a whole unfortunate box of problems, war broke out. And so George, Wilhelm, and Nicholas had their family tie, but it wasn't enough. And in 1911, what they called the Great War broke out. At first, that phrase, the Great War, was almost said pridefully, as a great adventure, as a great opportunity to serve. But the Great War turned into the biggest slaughter of humanity that had happened to date in the world. 10 million soldiers died. 8 million civilians died. Another 23 soldiers and civilians were wounded terribly in the war. And then finally, the peace was signed, but it was a very fragile and flawed peace, which meant 23 years later, World War II broke out, where not 20 million died, but 40 million died. You may remember from the history books, at least, that when World War I started, some even pridefully said it would be the war to end all wars. That became a very ironic and tragic phrase by the end of the war, because it certainly did not end wars. So we have this tragic scene of three cousins hoping that their blood family tie would keep the peace, but it didn't. It didn't. It wasn't strong enough with all the other forces at work, with all the needs of those same nations to protect their security and protect their economic interests and to protect their status and power. It wasn't enough. So what is enough to keep us together as a family? What is enough? What is strong enough to keep peace in the midst of so many complicated problems and so many complicated tensions? That's not an abstract question. That's not a question that just gets lightly posed on a Sunday morning or in a Bible class where we can debate it. It's a very relevant question because we are, again, a world at war. We are even a nation that is facing such tragic violence. The killing of 12 in California, in Thousand Oaks, California, just this last week. A week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, the killing of 11 in Pittsburgh. Just before that, the killing of two people, a couple in Kentucky, simply because they're black. So we have all kinds of mayhem going on, and it seems right now, as we look at the fires in California, that even Mother Earth is at war somehow or in turmoil. But then even to raise that question and try to debate whether there is climate change and what to do about that, that increases more conflict and more warring words amongst us. And meanwhile, when we go out to the world, we see the slaughter going on in Yemen and the killing in South Sudan and throughout the world. We, as God's people, find ourselves not only in the midst of complicated problems and challenges, but so swiftly turning to attacking words and even militant violence. And so what is the tie strong enough to hold us together? What is the bond strong enough at least to keep us around the table and talking to each other so that at least some of the times we can work things out before we are forced to send in dear sons and daughters to sacrifice their lives for the sake of some armistice. Well, Holy Scripture is clear that the one bond, the one tie that keeps us together is the bond that God makes when he makes us all as God's own dear children. It's what I began to talk with the children today. The one thing that lasts is nothing we do. The one thing that is true beyond all truths is when God comes to you and me and God says, "You are my dear one. You are my dear one. You are all my dear ones. I formed you in your mother's womb. When you were born, I breathed the holy breath into you. I have claimed you as my own. Nothing can take that away. And if I have done that to each one, if I have claimed each one of you as my dear ones, then you are together my holy family. You are my holy family." And it's that act of grace, it's that act of generosity, it's that act of life that finally bonds us together, that finally has the power to begin to heal the wounds, to sew us back together again. That great passage from Ezekiel where when all the bones and tendons and muscles were scattered and the power of God actually knit them back together again. It's the action of God in our lives to create us and to form us and to claim us and to hold us, which is finally the bond that we hold on to when we can't do anything else, to remind ourselves we are God's family. We are God's family. So let's work it out. There's a very pivotal passage in Mark chapter 3 where Jesus completely redefines what it means to be family. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus is in one of the villages and he's talking, and there's a whole crowd of people that have come to listen to him, and he's doing some healing and so forth. And it says that Jesus' mother, his mother Mary, and Jesus' brothers come to get Jesus to take him home because, as the text says, they think he's gone crazy. His family is coming to take Jesus home because they think Jesus is crazy. It says that they think he is beside himself. He is out of his mind. Well, what was he doing that they thought was crazy? Well, he was welcoming everybody into God's family. He was welcoming the lepers into God's family. He was welcoming the prostitutes into God's family. He was welcoming foreigners. Can you imagine that? He was welcoming foreigners into God's family. He was welcoming people who sat on the highest thrones, but also people who worked in the fields and couldn't do anything for himself. Everybody was part of the family, and they thought he was crazy. So they go to get Jesus, but there's such a crowd of people that Mary and his brothers can't actually get into the house where he's teaching. So they send a messenger in to tell Jesus that they're there. He should come out and go home. So the messenger comes in and says to Jesus, "Your mother and your brothers are here calling for you." And Jesus says, "Who are my mother and brothers?" And he looked at the crowd and said, "Here are my mother and brothers and sisters. Here is my family." Everybody connected to God is part of my family. And we're connected by God, by virtue of God's grace reaching out to grab us and to hold us, not by what we do. And so we are all part of God's family. I enjoyed a good taste of that expansive and life-changing power of God to make us family when just last Saturday, not last night, but a week ago last night, I was down at the Men's Correctional Center, the prison in Shelton, visiting our Lutheran congregation that we have, their Living Stones congregation. Some of you have probably visited there as well. Living Stones is made up of all the inmates. We have a pastor there. And I was there to install the new pastor, Pastor Chris Odie. That also, Living Stones is a ministry that we all do together. All of our offerings joined together is what makes that ministry happen. But what struck me is I was standing there waiting as we were inside the chapel room and the inmates were coming in who were going to worship. And I noticed that they were men from all kinds of different places. They were white and Latin American and African American and Middle Eastern, and some were young and old. Some looked kind of scruffy, others looked very polished, lots of different people. But as they came into the room, they not only greeted us, but they greeted each other with great warmth and great respect. And they said, "Brother, it's good to see you, good to see you." And then they sang hymns together. And I thought to myself, what's happening in this room is probably not what happens on a typical day in the hallways of the prison and out in the exercise yards, which can be a rough and tumble place in competition. One of the inmates I was talking to said, when I first came to prison, he says, a person sat down to me and said, don't sit at the cafeteria table with anybody who's not one of your type. Don't sit down at the cafeteria with anybody from a different color or a different belief, because you got to take care of yourself, and we got to stick together. We got to hold together tight, or it's all over for us. And the inmate said, I didn't believe that. I didn't want to believe that. That's what happens a lot here. But he said, not in this place. Not when we're gathered around the bread and wine. We are brothers here in this room. And so I saw that happening as men who, in the rest of society, would be thought of as enemies and competitors, because that's what we do to each other. They come into the room and they share the bread and wine with each other, and they sing hymns together. And they are God's family. And it's God's grace and God's mercy that has made that case. And so that's what Jesus wants to do for us. That's what finally brings us the peace that passes understanding. Not just the peace in our hearts, but in the midst of a very complicated world, the one bond, the one tie that has a power greater than any other power. All the other powers divide us, but that's the one power that holds us together. And so Jesus gathers us around this word today on this day in which we commemorate the ending of one of our wars, certainly to commemorate and to give thanks for those who make sacrifices as veterans, to pray for their souls and the spirits and hearts of their families and extended families who even today mourn that loss. So we gather to give thanks. We gather to mourn together, to pray. But I think we also gather at the time of the making of peace in that war to also say, how does God call us to be peacemakers? How does God call us to be peacemakers? And I'd like to give you two spiritual practices that as we, in everyday life, seek to be a peacemaker in a conflicted world. Here's two things you can do. Remember the old song, let there be peace on earth and let it begin with me? Here's something you can try out for yourself. And the first one is exactly what I told the children, is that this coming week, and maybe even the week after that, every time you meet someone in the grocery store, at work, person next door, every time you meet someone, practice saying to yourself, this one is a child of God. And we are together in God's family. Now, it's easiest for us to do that with some people more than others. If it's a person we already like, it's pretty easy to do. If it's someone in a kind of a challenging place and we have some sympathy for them, it's easy to do. But if it's someone doing or saying something we really don't like, it becomes very hard. And I'm not telling you have to like what they're doing or saying. Those are issues we have to work out as a human family. We have to help one another do what's best. But the beginning line, the baseline, is for you to look at that person and underneath all their stuff, recognize that they, like you, are a beloved child of God, created and formed and called by God. And it makes a difference. Because instead of approaching each other as, ordinarily when we meet someone, sometimes they're friends, but then they're strangers, or they're kind of scary looking, or they're competitors, or they're our enemies, to actually begin the encounter by recognizing we are sisters and brothers at the deepest level brings a whole new level of respect. And that's the second spiritual practice I'd like to suggest to you, is that it's what I call practicing respectful curiosity. After church today, I'll be doing a adult forum session on conflict facilitation. I'll go into this in more detail. But when you're involved in a conversation with someone, and particularly when you hear something that you really don't agree with, we have a hard time feeling a kinship oftentimes with people of other nationalities or other languages or other economic classes. But I think for a lot of us, it's harder for us to be patient with someone who thinks differently than we do, who actually has an opinion different than ours. But here's the practice. So when you hear someone saying something you just don't agree with, or you just don't understand, before you make a response to try to convince them how to think, practice respectful curiosity. Say, I'm curious why you say that. Tell me more. In other words, take the time at least to get clear on what they are saying before you disagree with them. Take the time to at least show them the honor of wanting to know what they're about and what they're doing. And then respond. You may agree with 5% of what they say, and you can tell them that and tell them why you disagree with 95%, or you may agree with quite a bit, or you may not agree with them at all. But it's just a major difference when, first of all, our attitude is that we're talking with a sister or a brother or a companion on the way. But secondly, we're going to take the time to understand each other. And that in itself is an incredible step towards peace. There are more things to do about that, but that's, I think, 2 spiritual practices we can do on an everyday basis that helps us be peacemakers. And so here we are on the 100th anniversary, honoring the dead, praying for the victims and their families, recognizing the sacrifices that have been made of veterans, but also being called by God to be a vanguard of peacemakers. That in a world that longs for peace, in a world that longs to be safe and to be together, we have this gift to share, which is the gift of God's love and the grace that has welcomed us into God's family, and so we welcome others. We commit ourselves to that. And the road is fuzzy, the road is unclear, but we walk that way by faith. As St. Paul said, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we shall see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known." And so faith, hope, and love abide, these 3. And the greatest of these is love. In Jesus' name, amen.